But there have been numerous stories of people telling that, they used to drink too much red wine, and now all of a sudden they lose this impetus to drink red wine again. I mean, so there are many things that people report that they have done, regularly, and that they don't fancy doing anymore when they're on the therapy. So it's not the sacrifice that you would expect. If you just went on a diet, it would be a terrible sacrifice, all the things that you can't do and that you're dreaming about day and night. But now it's completely different, and you can do it.
Welcome to Longevity by Design, a podcast designed to give individuals access to the leading scientific information in the field of longevity. The ability to add years to your life and life to your years needs no opinion. Join us as we ask science to take the wheel. In each episode, Dr. Gil Blander joins a co-host and an industry expert in the field of longevity, shining a light and getting the answers to the key question: how can we live a longer, healthier life?
Hello, I'm Dr. Gil Blander. Welcome to Longevity by Design, how to live a longer, healthier life. We produce by InstaTracker, your science-based guide to optimize your body from the inside out. Our guest today is Dr. Juul Holst, who will discuss GLP-1 agonist as an effective drug for obesity, diabetes, and many other diseases. Dr. Holst is a Danish physician and physiologist. He is known for discovering and describing the hormone GLP-1, a hormone in the gut that plays an important role in the onset and development of type 2 diabetes. He discovered that GLP-1 acts as a satiety hormone in humans. He is a professor of medical physiology in the Department of Biomedical Science at the Faculty of Health Science, University of Copenhagen, where he is also the vice chairman. He published over 1,000 peer-reviewed scientific publications. He is a member of several distinguished academic organizations, including the Danish Academy for Natural Science and the Royal Danish Academy of Science and Letters. Welcome, Jens.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate to be here.
Thank you. And I decided in this episode to divide it to two segments. Segment one will focus on the practical application of GLP-1 in humans, while in the segment two, we'll dive deeper into the science behind it. I encourage all of you to listen to both, but if the science feels a bit too complex, feel free to enjoy just segment one.
So I have to my best to keep it simple.
I know, but sometimes something that's simple to us, it's very hard for our listeners. So I would like to start from the beginning, and can you describe what is GLP-1?
So GLP-1 is a hormone, and it is produced in the gut, in the cells that are lining the gut. And there we have a large number of cells that produce hormones, and GLP-1 is simply just one of them. It is released when you eat, and it responds to both proteins and carbohydrates and lipids, and it signals to the brain that there's now a lot of food in the stomach or in the gut, and that it's time to slow down. So what it does is to inhibit appetite and to inhibit the movements of the gut and the stomach. It inhibits the emptying of the stomach. And it slows down all the secretion of the pancreatic juice and the gastric acid and so forth. So everything is done to slow down the process of ingestion and digestion. If anything has been absorbed already, it also helps to deposit this in the tissues, for instance, glucose. And it does that by stimulating at the same time insulin secretion, so that insulin can make sure that the glucose is absorbed in the tissues. So it has all of these mechanisms as a natural hormone.
Thank you. And what is a GLP-1 agonist, or what is the drug GLP-1?
So they're called GLP-1 receptor agonists, and that's because they interact with this receptor, which is the GLP-1 receptor. And the reason that this word is, or this designation is being used, is that substances that are not related to GLP-1 may still be able to interact with the receptor. And this is particularly true for two groups of things. One is small molecules, as we call them, and that is small chemical entities that are produced typically by the pharmaceutical industry that interacts with the receptors, but do not act precisely as the hormone, the endogenous hormone. So that's one very important group. And the other one is to include really a peptide called exenatide, which was the first GLP-1 receptor agonist to appear on the market under the name of Byetta. And this was isolated from the saliva of a poisonous lizard in the desert of Arizona, which is quite a unique story. And it interacts very nicely with the GLP-1 receptor and works very well. But it's not related to GLP-1 at all. Actually, this monster, this Gil monster, as it's called, has its own GLP-1, which looks very much like ours, but it's a different molecule from the saliva. And that is because of those two things that we use this term GLP-1 receptor agonist to include everything that acts on the GLP-1 receptor.
Understood. So let me see if I understood it correctly. A GLP-1 agonist is basically exogenous molecule that you inject or take orally, and it's basically able to bind to the GLP-1 receptor and then activate the signaling of GLP-1.
So this is one of the groups, at least. It hasn't to be one that you take in. You will also call the natural hormone for a GLP-1 receptor agonist because it acts on the receptor, of course. But you're right that the important thing is here the medications that you have been able to develop on the basis of this. Yes.
Okay. And what are the target organs of a GLP-1 or GLP-1 agonist? Where it is going when it's secreted from the gut?
Because of this kind of question, this was precisely why I described the actions of the hormone, the normal actions of the hormones, the way I did it, emphasizing the signaling which goes to the brain. That now there is enough food, now there are sufficient nutrients in the lower small intestine, which means that we shouldn't overload the system, and inhibits appetite and inhibits all the functions of the gastrointestinal tract of them, and then eventually also stimulates insulin secretion. But it was discovered because of its actions on insulin secretion. We pulled it out of intestinal extracts because of its mechanism on insulin secretion. So this was, of course, the focus for many years. So people will normally describe it as an insulin-stimulating hormone acting to lower blood glucose levels after meals. And this is what it does, actually. But the most important actions physiologically are the actions on food intake, appetite, and all these motor activities. So what is the most important or immediate actions of the hormone? Well, that depends a little bit on whether we are talking normal conditions or whether we are talking people with diabetes who are receiving a portion of the hormone, because these people will have a stimulation of insulin secretion, and that is very helpful. But they will also have an inhibition of appetite, and that will make them lose weight. And eventually, this will become a very important mechanism of action also.
Okay. So again, I'm trying to put it in my words. So GLP-1 can activate insulin secretion. It can work on our brain and send a signal, hey, we ate enough. You don't need to eat anymore.
Precisely.
It can also delay the progress of the food in our gut. And that's also make us feel full.
It will make you feel full, not necessarily satiated, but full. Yes, you're right.
Yeah. And anything that I miss or that the GLP-1 is doing?
So I think these actions are very important, but once we come into looking at patients with disturbances, people with obesity or diabetes, and already a beginning of perhaps developing cardiovascular heart and circulation problems, then it also has some other very important activities. That is on inflammation and on the health of the vascular system. And they become very important once we look at the patients. How much they actually do in the healthy individual, I simply cannot tell you. I simply don't know. It's very likely that there are some activities of it normally going on, but they don't show up because you don't have a readout. You are not ill. You do not have inflammation and things like that. So we cannot tell really, but I'm sure it works.
Okay, that was very helpful. Now let's switch gear into diseases, and you started to talk about diabetic patients. So let's talk about that. What is the effect of the GLP-1 agonist on a diabetic patient?
Yeah, see, this was, of course, it took a while, before we dared to give it to patients with diabetes, because it came out from the gut as a new hormone, and it did stimulate insulin secretion. But the prediction in those days was that it would not work in people with diabetes. We had another hormone, the other incretin hormone, which is called GIP. And we already knew at that time, we had done that, shown that it didn't work in people with diabetes. And this whole mechanism of insulin stimulation by the gut hormones, the incretin mechanism, was impaired in people with diabetes. It actually didn't work at all. So the prediction was that this would not work at all. So it took some time before, we had gathered sufficient courage to try and look at this in people with diabetes. And then eventually we did the first studies, and it turned out that it did stimulate insulin secretion, even in people with diabetes. And then, of course, was a fantastic discovery. And then rather quickly thereafter, we started to infuse people with GLP-1 and noted that we could completely normalize their blood glucose levels. We did that in 1993 in a wonderful study done together with Michael Nauk in Germany, where we could demonstrate this. And this was because of stimulated insulin secretion and because of inhibited secretion of glucagon, which was one of the other new actions of the hormone that had not been predicted at all, but is a very important action also. So that was the beginning, and that was how it worked.
Yeah. And so what percentage of diabetic patients that are taking GLP-1 have complete remission and they become normal?
That's a good question. So what we know today, which is really fantastic, is that with the very powerful new GLP-1 agonists, let's take tirzepatide from Eli Lilly as an example. In those registration studies, almost in all of them, more than 50% of those patients with type 2 diabetes that had tirzepatide for more than 40 weeks in the high dose, more than 50% of those had completely normal glucose levels. And that was expressed in the terms of hemoglobin A1C, which is, the kind of long-acting or long-term glucose levels. And they had levels below 5.7%, which is completely normal. So if you will, half of the people can expect to have completely normal levels after this kind of dose.
Yeah, and
which is fantastic.
Yeah, that's crazy because we know that I'm going now to longevity and aging. We know that diabetes is like, if you compare diabetic person versus normal person, they live like a decade less on average. Or
something like that. That is true.
Yeah, and think about think about what is the effect. It's like it's a real revolution. It's amazing. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Let me give you an example of why we think that this may also apply to the GLP-1 agonists. So they have been on the market, of course, only for about 2 years, and we're talking about Wegovy, and we're talking about Zepbound, or Mounjaro, right? The American one. But the reason we think that this may be the way it happens comes from studies of people with bariatric surgery, with low and wide gastric bypass. And we now know from huge studies with hundreds of thousands of people in, that those that have had a gastric bypass because of obesity, that had diabetes at the baseline, they will expect to live 9 years more. That has been demonstrated directly. And the mechanism whereby these people lose weight is the same. It is the gut hormones. It is GLP-1 secretion that makes them eat less. So we can somehow allow ourselves to speculate that the same will apply to long-term use of the GLP-1 agonists.
That's amazing. And what should be the target weight loss in order to see the remission of diabetes?
Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the best studies so far is the study of semaglutide, or Wegovy as it's called, in people with obesity and increased cardiovascular risk. That was a study which is called the SELECT trial in 17,600 people for 4 years. And in that study, there was a very significant reduction in the risk of dying and getting complications in terms of myocardial infarction and stroke. And that was reduced by 20%. The reduction in body weight was about 10% on average, between 10 and 11% over those 4 years. If we think of tirzepatide instead, there is a very interesting, very recent study which is an extension of one of the weight loss studies they were doing. They're called the SURMOUNT trials. And this was the SURMOUNT 1 trial, which was extended up to 3 years. In that study, they were looking at the risk of converting from normal glycemia to diabetes, because these people are all obese, and even if they don't have diabetes already, they are at very high risk of developing diabetes, and a lot of them developed diabetes in the control study with placebo. But those that had tirzepatide, they had a 94% reduced risk of developing diabetes. In other words, it was almost eliminated, that conversion into diabetes during this trial in 3 years. So that's a really fantastic result.
That's amazing. So it's much bigger than the 50% that you said before, which is...
I'm sorry, but
no,
it's really amazing.
It's even better.
Amazing.
Yeah, I think that it's amazing news for the diabetic population. I remember 2 years ago, you presented at ARDD, and after your presentation, I picked up the phone and called my father-in-law, which is a diabetic, and I told him, you have to start taking GLP-1 agonist. It was so strong. So everyone that listening here and is a diabetic or have a family member that is diabetic, let them know about that and
discuss it with their doctor.
Discuss it with your clinician, of course. Don't go and buy it in the black market or something like that.
Don't do that.
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the effects of GLP-1, but there are a lot of other, for example, obesity. So can you describe a bit about that?
Yeah, so again, since this was a new hormone when we discovered it, and nobody could know about this, but it was known that there had to be hormones from the gut that would influence appetite regulation. And it was already the first one where this was demonstrated was the hormone cholecystokinin, and this was in 1973. That never found out as a useful structure for drug development for many reasons. But so it was already on the agenda that this is something one should look after with gut hormones, because they might have an effect here. So eventually we got around to do this after having shown all these effects on the motor activities, the movements in the gut and all that. And eventually we did a formal study of the hormone in people, looking at appetite registration and food intake, and could demonstrate that it inhibited food intake and appetite feelings. So that was really the beginning. And then it was a question of following this up into obesity therapy. And that was quite a long ride, I will have to say, and a complicated one too. So the first problem that came up was, of course, that we could demonstrate it already in around 2000, that the effect on food intake was dose related. So the more you could give of the compound, the less you would eat. And that was, of course, important. But the problem was that the more you gave of the peptide, the more side effects there would be. And we did some formal studies of dose response studies of this, and found that there were certain doses, if you exceeded them, you would vomit simply and be in bad shape. So there was a definite limit to what you could do. So during the entire development in the beginning, this was the balance between, on one hand, the actions on appetite and food intake, and on the other hand, the side effects, of course. And we were very afraid in the beginning of these side effects. So things had to develop very slowly. So what happened was that at the Novo Nordisk company, they managed to produce a long-acting GLP-1 molecule that was useful for daily administration. That was liraglutide, or Victoza as it was called. It was approved in 2009 after a long, difficult story. It's really amazing. Okay. But it was. And it demonstrated in all the clinical study a nice drop in body weight, about 3-4 kilograms. I mean, nothing sensational, still good, because the other medications, insulin, for instance, and sulfonylureas, they would all cause weight gains. Yeah. And the patients were really unhappy about that. And it also was bad for their metabolism. So this was a great step ahead, but it was not enough, of course. So we all felt, and the Novo Nordisk company also felt, that something had to be done. So people did a dose response study, a very careful one with very slow up titration of the dosing, and found out that, yes, it was possible to increase the doses up to, normally it was 1.2 or 1.8 milligrams, but you could increase it up to 3 milligrams per day. And that turned out to have a good effect on food intake and body weight. 7-8% it was now. And it was followed by a number of registration studies, the STEP trials, and they were positive, all of them. And then it was approved for obesity therapy because this was a new thing. It's the first time, this was possible. It's the compound which was sold under the name of Saxenda, which was developed here. So that was a tremendous development. And the first time that this thing, treatment of obesity came into the picture. And this was really a revolution because everybody would say until that day that it's people's own business and they're themselves responsible for this. And there's nothing you could do about it anyway. And everything works poorly. So why bother? But here was the first step. But again, it was never a huge success. And the reason it was never a huge success was, of course, that the weight loss was not big enough. And a number of studies indicated that you need to have rather large weight losses, around 10%, to be absolutely sure to have a good cardiovascular effect on survival and all that, what we call the hard endpoints, right? And particularly the famous study, the Look Ahead trial, where 5,000 people were looked at for 10 years with intense behavioral modification, lifestyle changes. It was demonstrated that it didn't work. 10 years of fortunes that were invested and a lot of 5,000 people were looked at, and all of this didn't work. But there was a subgroup of individuals in this trial, those that were able to lose 10% in body weight. They had a 23% improvement in cardiovascular risk and mortality. So it was a question of getting there to the higher doses. So at Novo Nordisk, they developed a new compound, a second generation GLP-1, which is the one what is called semaglutide, which is now weekly administration. And it was optimized for both insulin secretion and food intake and food intake in experimental animals. So this was semaglutide that came on the market. And it was, of course, studied in all the registration trials, the so-called SUSTAIN trials. And they came out very well. And the cardiovascular risk was beautifully reduced, and glucose levels were improved and everything. But the weight loss was not fantastic. It was, let's say about 8% at the most, something like that. 8-9% maybe. So again, it was felt that perhaps with a new dose response study, we could get even higher. And that was then done. And sure enough, with doses up to, as we know today, 2.4 milligrams per week, it was possible to get a weight loss of up to 15%. And then the registration trials, the STEP trials were completed, and we had these weight losses of up to 18%. And that is, of course, what was the difference. So that was how it was developed into the successful therapy. And of course, the Eli Lilly people followed suit and developed the very successful tirzepatide molecule, where similar studies, their so-called SURMOUNT trials, showed that you could develop weight losses of up to 24-25%. Fantastic.
Yeah. And Jens, what was the length of time from the discovering GLP-1 till the moment that you had a drug that can decrease the weight by 18%?
That's a long time. So that was 1986 and until 2022, right? Something like that.
Wow. So that's like more than 30 years. I think that it's good for the audience to understand that literally it's like 3 decades plus of working hard to bring like a game changer drug like that to the market. Yeah, it's not easy. It's not easy. It's very hard. And I'm sure that our audience really appreciate what you and your team and a lot of other people. I'm sure that it's thousands of people that work on that to bring it to that place. So that's amazing, the effect of on weight loss, but there are a lot of other positive effect of GLP-1. You mentioned it slightly about cardiovascular diseases. So can you discuss that?
Yes. So again, it was not entirely expected that this would happen, but what happened was that the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration in the United States, demanded of new diabetes drugs that they were tested for cardiovascular safety. And this was because there were some problems with a TZD compound called rosiglitazone that was suspected of causing cardiovascular problems, myocardial infarctions. So they said from now on, all drugs will have to be tested very carefully. So what happened in the meantime is that the SGLT2 inhibitors, the sodium glucose cotransporter inhibitors, SGLT2 inhibitors, canagliflozin and things like that, were introduced to the market, and they were the first to come out in a real cardiovascular outcome trial. And that was called the EMBEREG studies. They were published, they were shown for the first time in 2015 at a meeting in Stockholm. And it's one of the most exciting meetings I've been to ever in my life. The results were fantastic. There was a great decrease in the risk of developing cardiovascular deaths and myocardial infarction and stroke, and also heart failure. It was really amazing. And we were all, shouting. We were standing on the chairs, and we were 5,000 people in that hall, and we were absolutely crazy. It was really wonderful. Okay, so that was the start. But that was not GLP-1, of course. So at the same time, of course, GLP-1 was also investigated in a huge cardiovascular outcome trial, the so-called LEADER trial. And it was presented half a year later at an American Diabetes Congress in Chicago. I was there. And it was very exciting if they would be able to do it. But it came out positive, fortunately. So we had exactly the same improvement, the same reduction in the risk of MACE, major adverse cardiovascular events, with the liraglutide that was with the liraglutide in those days, as we had with the SGLT2 inhibitors. So that was, of course, very nice and very relieving. I must say that nobody knows today the precise mechanisms whereby the SGLT2 inhibitors work. I'm afraid I have to say also that we don't know precisely how the GLP-1s do this. You could think that since they're both, meant for diabetes, that would be one of the possible explanations, but it's definitely not the entire explanation. And there are specific actions of these two classes of anti-diabetic agents that play a very important role on top of that. But so that's what started this business here. And from now on, it's just been, accelerating all the time. And today, I think the way to look at it is that we have profound effects of the GLP-1 receptor agonists on three important things. One is weight loss, because it is, as I already told you, very important to lose weight if you are at risk here, and you can do a lot to save your life and reduce your complication rates, but just by losing weight. So that's a very important factor. We know that for sure. But then in addition, there are two actions of the GLP-1s that are really important. One is on inflammation, because obesity and diabetes are associated with a systemic, weak, but still present inflammation. And you can tell that from the inflammatory markers in the circulation. And now it turns out that GLP-1 therapy is associated with a very profound reduction of these inflammatory markers, indicating that you reduce the interstitial inflammation with these agents. And that seems to be an effect that is independent of obesity. And the reason I say this is that one of the GLP-1 agonists that has a very poor weight loss effect still has the effect on the cardiovascular risk. So that's what we think. The other thing is that it has direct effects on the vascular system, on the capillaries, on the small blood vessels, where you could demonstrate that it slows down progression of atherosclerosis, and that it helps against inflammation, and it improves the health of the capillaries under a lot of different circumstances. So you have two important actions that are all applied for the body as a whole. Circulation is everywhere, of course, and inflammation is everywhere. So this is all of the body, and that explains probably that you can have beneficial effects on the brain and on the heart and on the kidneys and on the liver, everywhere. So those are the important things.
It's very interesting. And on top of that, GLP-1 is also have a positive effect on cognition and dementia. So can you discuss that?
Yes, that has fortunately also been described in now an accumulating number of investigations, and it's really huge. Again, my explanation that I will offer is those two: one on the circulatory system, on the blood vessels, and on the second on the inflammation, because that will also affect and apply to the brain. Otherwise, it's a little bit of a problem to get these agents to the actual brain. But that's not necessary if you think that the main effect is on inflammation and circulation. because then you can understand that this also applies to the brain. But it's true what you say, that there are fantastic effects now, and on one is a cognitive impairment that will be improved. That was already very nicely shown with dulaglutide, the original compound from Eli Lilly. And now we have very large studies of dementia, which is being improved. The risk is decreased very considerably. It's also decreased by weight loss, but again, it's a very nice effect. And the first reports now on Alzheimer's disease have come out with a very strong effect. There was a big real-world study published just a few weeks ago. There are 2 major clinical trials that will be finished here at the end of 2024. The Evoke trials, they're called, and that's going to be very exciting because they're dedicated controlled clinical trials to look at this effect specifically. But it looks very good. And so on an average, it really seems that this is beyond all expectations, but it's very good.
Yeah, no, it is amazing. And I just want to go back for a second to what you said about cardiovascular diseases and how the FDA actually force you guys to look at the cardiovascular diseases. So a lot of scientists and people are saying, oh, the FDA is delaying, and here is a good example of why what the FDA done is actually good for humanity, and help us to find something that nobody would look for if they haven't insisted.
You're absolutely right. And the information that has been gathered from all these trials, the cardiovascular outcome trials, is absolutely amazing. There's so much data. It's not even completely digested yet.
Yeah.
There's still beautiful results coming out of these studies. So from that point of view, it's absolutely wonderful that they did it. The problem, of course, is that who pays this? That's the patients.
Novo Nordisk, isn't it?
No, that's the patients.
At the end,
the patients that pay it in the
price,
end, because they, of course, transport all the expenses further on to the patients, to the payers, of course.
Yeah,
so that's the only problem there is. It has cost a lot of money.
Yeah, no, I understand. Now, but more than that, there are also positive effects on kidney diseases.
That is true.
Can you discuss that?
That is very interesting. For a while, it was thought that there was mainly an effect on albuminuria, that is the protein loss of the kidneys, which is also a characteristic of diabetic kidney disease. And there was a nice effect on albuminuria. And again, actually, the SGLT2 inhibitors were leading the way with demonstrations of a very profound effect, beneficial effect on the kidney. So the GLP-1s have been holding a little bit behind. But now it turns out that there are very good effects of the GLP-1 receptor agonists also on kidney, and not only on albuminuria, but actually on real kidney function measured the gold standard way, that is by glomerular filtration. That is the kidney function measure that really matters, where it has been clearly demonstrated now, particularly in the dedicated FLOW trial of 3,500 people who looked at for 4 years or up to 5 years, where a clear improvement in kidney function, glomerular filtration rate, was demonstrated during therapy with the semaglutide. It was in that case. And I know that there's something similar is being observed also with tirzepatide. So now people are looking at more specific effects, protective effects on the kidneys. And the kidneys are interesting because, there are receptors in the kidneys for GLP-1, and there are receptors on what we call the afferent arterioles, those that lead to the little corpuscles, that where the filtration occurs. And this is interesting. I really strongly suggest that GLP-1 has something direct to do with the kidney function. And in addition, it also influences the secretion of what we call angiotensin II, one of the hormones from the kidney that are involved also in blood pressure regulation. So this may explain some of the actions on the kidneys and also on the blood pressure, which is lowered very nicely during therapy. And there are some studies that indicate that what they do really is they improve oxygenation, the supply of oxygen to the kidneys. And that is very helpful because lack of sufficient oxygenation is one of the problems in the development of kidney disease. So we're slowly beginning to understand this. But you're absolutely right. This is something that is of great interest these days and very beneficial.
Yeah. And last but not least, in preparation for the interview, I did some research and I've seen that there are some new indication that it might be a good for fertility treatment, both for male and female. I'm not sure if you've seen that or know about that.
But what kind of treatment? I'm sorry.
Fertility to make
fertility.
Yeah.
See, yes, I've seen the data.
Yeah. Okay.
Yes. Well, that is not very strange that this happens, because one of the main reasons for female infertility is the PCO syndrome, the polycystic ovary syndrome. And it is very well known that this is associated with insulin resistance and obesity and all that. So if you can do something, if you can ameliorate the metabolism of these individuals, they will immediately become pregnant. And we knew that already. You can even do it with metformin. Not very effective, but you can do it with metformin. So once GLP-1s were introduced in the form of liraglutide, it turned out that yes, these people became pregnant. It was not advised because, this was a new drug and people had to be very careful about fetal problems or developmental problems, of course. So it was not advised, but it took place anyway. And fortunately, at least as far as I know, there hasn't been any problems with malformations or any fetal problems in developmental problems. Certainly hope that will not. But it looks good in terms of what the clinical experience so far. And because they are so very effective in diabetes and obesity treatment, they will necessarily also improve chances of fertility. And that is true for females, and it's also true for males. And we actually know that already, that if you can lower body weight, you can also improve your fertility. So that's the most likely, at least it's the direct explanation, right, if you will. And there's nothing strange about it. Again, I'll say that I wouldn't advise people to use this, because we haven't a ton of experience with those drugs when it comes to fetal development. So I would be careful. I would avoid it. I wouldn't use it to promote fertility, yes, until we have a much better material of experience in this field.
So what is the recommend right now for a pregnant woman? She shouldn't inject a GLP-1, or she can?
I'm not sure that there are straight recommendations yet. So far, the recommendation is that she should not take it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. That's again, giving the doubt about the fetal development.
Makes sense. And just to summarize this initial section, it's amazing what one drug can do. It's like we covered, I would say, a lot of different, I would say mainly metabolic related diseases. And it sounds like GLP-1 is doing a lot about that. My next question will be about cancer. Any data about cancer or not yet?
Yes, there is data about cancer also. And that's an interesting story because, very soon after its discovery and the first effects were looked at, there were fears that it might generate actually cancers. And that's because it was documented to be protective for the beta cells. And it is protective for the beta cells. So there were, small reports that maybe it would stimulate the growth of endocrine cells in the pancreas and cause pancreatic cancers in that way. And there were a couple of American groups that were very convinced about this, and it took a long time and a lot of discussion to get to the place where we could say that it was safe to use also against perhaps very few cases of cancer. And it turned out that there was a real problem with some of the preclinical animals, rats and mice, because they developed cancers of their thyroid, so-called medullary carcinomas of a certain cell type in the thyroid that produces a hormone that's called calcitonin.
Yeah.
And it turned out that these animals, they did with high doses develop cancers. And it then came along detective work to find out how that was. And it turned out that they express a high density of GLP-1 receptors on these cells, whereas humans and primates, monkeys, they do not. We have a completely different system and regulation of the calcitonin secretion. But it was still demanded that calcitonin measurements were made on thousands and thousands of patients that were receiving GLP-1 agonists to try to see if there was an increase in the secretion. But that turned out not to be the case. So that story is gone now. There's still a warning on the package that you should not give it to people where you suspect a C-cell cancer, one of these cancers. But they are very rare, and it has not been substantiated at all. So that risk is gone. The other recent development, which is very nice, is there is the obesity-related cancers. So there are at least 13, maybe 14 types of cancer that are dependent on body weight, that are accelerated, increased with obesity. And a recent study has really looked at this in detail on huge numbers of patients and found that 10 of those 13 cancer types were very much reduced during therapy with a GLP-1 agonist.
Wow.
So that is really reassuring these days, these new data. So that's, for instance, colonic cancer and pancreas cancer. So several types of cancers that have been now demonstrated to be reduced, actually, the risk reduced by GLP-1 therapy.
As a Longevity by Design podcast listener, you understand the value of improving your health for today and for all the years ahead. And if you want to live your healthiest, longest life possible, you need to understand what's going on inside. At Inside Tracker, we take a personalized approach to healthspan optimization that eliminates guesswork from your wellness plan. Inside Tracker analyzes blood biomarker and DNA data, along with physiomarker data from fitness trackers like Oura Ring, to deliver personalized food, supplement, lifestyle, and exercise recommendations that allow you to take control and improve your health span. And for a limited time, Longevity by Design listeners can get 20% off at the Inside Tracker store. So if you're ready to receive a personal health analysis and data-driven wellness plan to optimize your body for the long haul, then it's time to start inside. Visit insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today. That's insidetracker.com/podcast to get started today.
My next question is about, firstly, again, it's amazing what a GLP-1 is doing. Now, a bit of a practical question that I'm sure that our listener would like to know. The first one is, should me as a patient will be on a GLP-1 for life? And what will happen if I will stop injecting it?
Yeah, so that's a very good question. So in the way it works, namely by reducing appetite, suggests that you have to stay on the therapy. Because if you stop, then you cannot reduce your appetite any longer, and you will be hungry and you'll start eating more. And that's exactly what happens if you terminate the therapy. And that's been demonstrated in several studies, and that applies to all of them, really. So that suggests that you must do something. On the other hand, it is an unpleasant feeling that you have to be on therapy for the rest of your life. So a lot of people are, of course, interested in trying to find another solution to this. And it's not being completely explored yet, but there are suggestions that you may be able to maintain your weight loss with lower doses. And that's where I would go, definitely, personally, try lowering the doses very much. It's actually been demonstrated in some studies that you can maintain the body weight loss with lower doses and even of liraglutide, the original compound. So there is hope there. The other thing is that during the weight loss phase, which lasts 1.5 up to 2 years, that's how long it should be. That's and for the up titration is half a year, and then you are simply waiting for the weight loss to happen. In that period, that's when you should change your lifestyle. You should use the opportunity to change the lifestyle in that period, and that applies both to the diet. And the good news is you can do it because you do not any longer have this obsession against food. You can pass your kitchen without having to grab something and pass the cake shop without having one. And so you can start planning a diet, not necessarily with something that you don't like, but, whatever. I mean, a better choice, simply. And the other thing is physical activity, which is also something that should be changed. And again, the good news is that you can do it because now you weigh less. You will have less arthritis, less pain. It will be easier. And, it doesn't necessarily imply that you should lift weights all the day and things like that, or run marathons. It's just a question of walking perhaps half an hour every day. That will be very helpful. And if you do both of these things, change your diet and improve your physical pattern, then there's a much better chance that you can maintain the weight loss even without drugs. And that has been demonstrated. So, of course, it's a question of maintaining those good habits also. At least that's what we think now. There are no miracles, I'm afraid, here.
Yeah.
But that is one of the ways to do it. A very important aspect of it.
Yeah.
And the other very important thing about the weight loss is, and the physical activity is, that in that way you can also maintain your lean body mass, your muscle mass. Because then you will lose, undoubtedly, with weight losses of this magnitude, you will lose a lot of lean body mass also. About a third of the weight loss will be lean body mass that has been lost. And that's bad, because when you come out on the other end, then you don't have your good muscles anymore, and you may feel weak and you be in trouble. Elderly people that are already weak, but obese, will be in even greater trouble. So, but this can be prevented with some more physical activity during the daily life. And again, it's not huge what it requires. The WHO says 150 minutes per week. So you can tell that it's not a lot. It's not huge.
Yeah.
And it could, as I said, be a brisk walk or even a normal walk will be very helpful. So this is really important.
Yeah. So a couple of comments about that. I think that's a very important point. Last week, we released an episode with an expert of taste and smell and how we sense it. And basically, we are training our body to like stuff. So I gave last week the example that I didn't like avocado, but when I tested my blood, I've seen that I have an issue with cholesterol and glucose, and avocado have a healthy fat. So I started to eat it. And after a while, I liked avocado. So I think that this is a great analogy for what happened with GLP-1. You got a present. The present is a drug that helps you to lose weight. Even if you continue to eat Cheetos all the time, still you lose weight. But try not to eat Cheetos. At that time, try to move to fruit and vegetable and find what you like that is good. And then you'll train your body to continue to do that. So that's one point. The second point is about losing the lean mass or the muscle. As you said, that's a very important point. And when you are going on a GLP-1, you should, on parallel, take a gym membership and start going there and start lifting weight. That's the cost. Yeah.
But I think it's very important to tell that, it's of course very efficient to do it that way, but you don't have to lift weights and you don't have to go to the gym if you don't like that.
Yeah.
Go out for a walk instead or buy a bicycle or something.
Exactly. The most important thing is to do what you like and eat what you like, because if you won't do that, you won't sustain it. There are, 1% of the population that can understand what is good and doing it. Everyone knows that if you eat fruit and vegetable and not Cheetos and chocolate, you will lose weight. But 99% of us cannot do that. So find what you like.
But there have been numerous stories of people telling that, they used to drink too much red wine, and now all of a sudden they lose this impetus to drink red wine again. So there are many things that people report that they have done, regularly, and that they don't fancy doing anymore when they're on the therapy. So it's not the sacrifice that you would expect. If you just went on a diet, it would be a terrible sacrifice, all the things that you can't do, that you're dreaming about day and night. But now it's completely different, and you can do it.
Yeah. So again, it is amazing what the GLP-1 agonist drug can do. But as you discussed before, there are some negative effects. For example, you lose muscle. Can we, for a second, discuss that? What are the side effects of injecting GLP-1?
Yeah, but this is actually an important one, I think. So let's just add a few more words to that. That is, you have to, because the weight loss is quite severe, and if you are not among the very heavy ones, but maybe your main problem is diabetes, then you have to make sure that you get an adequate diet, that you get the supplies of protein that you need for your body. So you have to think about this while you're on therapy. And several people may need to supplement with protein in their daily food intake, because otherwise they will have too little. And the same is true for vitamins and for calcium and for, things like that. Simply because you reduce the amount of food you take in, and you have to maintain the essential ingredients as well as possible.
One point, Jans, about the protein, I think that's a very important point. And there is more and more data that also show that when you consume enough amount of protein, your appetite is also going lower. So it's like a chicken and an egg in a way.
That could help a little bit. Yeah, we've been very interested in that aspect of protein ingestion. And it's true. So that may help. Maybe it's the same mechanism though, but okay.
Yeah. No, so what I'm saying is continue to inject, eat more protein, maybe even the weight loss will be bigger, but also it will help you to maintain or build the muscle because you need the protein for the muscle. So I think that's a very important point what you raised. But let's go back for a second for the side effects. So what are the side effects of the drug?
So the main immediate side effect is, again, the nausea and the vomiting, the gastrointestinal side effects. And you may have, some people will never get completely rid of that side effect, and they may not be able to maintain a therapy with the GLP-1s. Unfortunately, then there are other possibilities instead. But mostly, generally, by up titrating very slowly or by staying at a lower dose, you can make this a tolerable problem. So for most people, it will end up being a possibility to, maintain a balance between what you can tolerate and the effects that you are looking after. So that is quantitatively the biggest problem. Another problem is gallstones. There is a small increase in the risk of developing gallstones. This is also seen with weight loss by other means and mechanisms. It is. So here is something that you will have to take into consideration. A few of the patients will develop gallstones, and you will have to be prepared to treat that. That is not considered, a very serious complication, but still, it is something that you will have to do something about. Fortunately, that can be done. So that's another problem that has shown up. Most of the other things that have really been brought up are not terribly relevant. If you have a person with what we call gastroparesis already, that is a weak motor function of the stomach, you'll have to be careful with a GLP-1 agonist, because in that case, you may aggravate it. They're very rare, these individuals. But that, again, is a kind of side effect that is born out of the mechanism of action of the hormone. So you cannot have both. So that's something to consider. The same is true for surgery. It is now recommended that you perhaps pause for while you are on therapy, because otherwise there may be some retention of food in the stomach when you start anesthesia, and that may increase the risk of aspiration, as we call it. So at least you have to be a little bit considerate about this. And also there will be other motor problems from the GI tract, for instance, diarrhea or constipation, but that will have to be considered, effects of the hormones rather than side effects. And for some people that have a tendency in one direction, that might be aggravated, but you cannot say anything in general, except that there are profound effects on the motor activities of the gut. So you'll have to take that into consideration. It usually does not represent a major problem.
One more a point that I heard, and I think that we discussed it earlier this year, is the increase of resting heart rate. What do we think about that? I know that it's not big, but it's something that, especially I think that's important for the people that injecting it to look good on the beach. So people like you and me that are not obese and they're taking it just to look good on the beach. Does it? I think that's the cost versus the value starting to play. But
from the cardiology point of view, anything that increases heart rate is not considered to be good for you, because it increases the strain of the heart, the work of the heart. Yeah. It's a challenge for the heart. Yeah. And if you have a problem with your heart already, it wouldn't be good. So it has been considered by several groups and cardiologists what this really means. Fortunately, today we have a very good impression of what goes on. It is a direct effect on the sinus node of the heart. There are receptors there, and they are clearly associated with an increased heart rate. So it's not an activation of the sympathetic system, which would be good, which would not be good, because that has been demonstrated so many times that if you increase the activity of the sympathetic nervous system, you will run into cardiovascular problems eventually. And that's what has stopped all the drugs for obesity therapy that worked by this principle. Yeah. And that's why, in general, treatments that act on increasing energy metabolism are somewhat risky. But this is, of course, completely different. So, but on the other hand, we have this very improved cardiovascular risk at the same time. So the two are kind of fighting each other. And you're right in saying that what if we could avoid the effect on the heart rate? Would it then be even better? And that's possible. But we have currently no way of telling. Yeah. This is actually something that some people are working on, trying to see if you can separate out this. I don't think it's going to be easy because it's a direct effect on the heart. What the creator thought about this when this was made, I really honestly don't know. I know that if you acutely give GLP-1 to people, you'll increase the heart rate, you'll increase the cardiac output, and blood will be redistributed to certain areas of the body. And that is perhaps the idea behind it, because you get, after a meal, you get a response, there's a secretion, and then, the heart is helped to pump blood to the splanchnic regions and to the regions of the body where you need to deposit the nutrients and all that. Maybe that's the way you should think about it. But once you have, as we in the GLP-1s, that we have a constant exposure, it is, of course, a different situation, which was not intended physiologically. But again, apparently, any negative effects of that are outweighed by the beneficial effects on cardiovascular risk.
Okay, thank you for that. And I have many more questions, but I really want to go to segment 2, but still I have a few that I want to ask. So the first one is about the new drug that you mentioned it, Lilly came, which is basically a combination of GLP-1 and GIP. And there, the weight loss is much higher. It's what I've seen is get to 26% or something like that, while the novo nordisk is around 18%. So if a patient or someone would like to consume GLP-1, what would you recommend if you can?
So I would look at the individual and say, how much do you need to lose?
Okay.
Do you have a severe problem or is it less severe? Yeah. And then, I would say, isn't it lucky that we have 2 different drugs for this? Because if you have problems with one, then you can try the other, because they are not completely identical. That we know for sure. And it's not impossible that if you have problems with one of them, then you may be able to use the other one instead. And this is true vice versa, really. So, but of course, if you want to lose a lot of weight in a hurry, I would go for the stronger ones. So
the Lilly one not only decreased 26%, but also is doing it faster. So if, I don't know, I have a wedding and I need to lose 10 pounds.
That I have to think about for a while. But, I need to go back and compare the steepness, the slope of the weight loss for the 2 compounds to see if that is really true. I will say that right now, you can start asking, why is one apparently more effective than the other one? And there you can look at the data and say, okay, with the Lilly compound, they were using up to 15 milligrams per day, or per week, I'm sorry. Whereas in the other program, they were using from 1 to 2.4 milligrams per day. I mean, so that's about, 5 times more, right?
Yeah.
So isn't that a very good explanation for the difference? I think it's at least a very important part of the difference. And I know that Novo Nordisk has been testing higher doses, and they are more efficacious. They're very preliminary data. They've just been reported with 8 and 16 milligrams in people with type 2 diabetes. And there was clear increases in the weight losses and also in the effects on hemoglobin A1C with the higher doses. So that is at least one of the explanations.
Okay. And one more question about, I see more and more data discussing the oral versus the injectable. And it sounds like very soon we'll move mainly to oral because it's easy. We are lazy. We don't like oral. So it's not comfortable to inject yourself. So what do you see about that? What is
So first of all, let me tell you an anecdote. So I was a member of an advisory board for one of the companies. And so we were about 10 advisors or something like that, or even more. And they asked us this was in the early days of that, what we would prefer, a daily pill or a weekly injection. And every single advisor said, a weekly injection.
Wow.
Yep. Because, we're doctors, so we're not afraid of injections with a small needle that you can't even feel. Yeah. And, this is something it's actually important. This is something you do, for instance, on a Sunday morning when you clip your toenails, you also have your injection. This is one of the things you do once weekly, right? And you can remember it in that way. And you're not a patient. You're not ill. You're just doing this, cutting your toenails and taking the injection. That's what you do on a Sunday, right? So you lead a normal life after that. Whereas with the pill, you have to, at least with the semaglutide pill, you have to be fasting. That means that you must have the pill on the table next to your bed. And the first thing you have to do when you wake up is to take the pill while you're still fasting, and then abstain from having food for half an hour, which is good for some, but practical for some, but not for all. So there are problems with that. But on the other hand, that is just one of the oral versions that are out there. There are other oral versions in development, and there's, as I said, small molecules, small chemical entities that are by nature orally available, and you can just take them, and they will be absorbed, and it's not a problem. And that is, if that is successful, and a couple of them look very successful right now already in the phase 3 studies will soon, not very soon, but soon be available, and they look very good. That will revolutionize the therapy once more, because it will be much easier and cheaper to produce large amounts of these small molecule compounds. And that means that the supply problem that we have right now can be solved much easier. Okay. So that's a very important aspect of it. And again, I hope not that people will all demand the oral ones, particularly not the semaglutide versions, because, you use a lot more material in the pills than you do in the injection. So the world supplies are threatened here.
Yeah, it's less efficient. No, I understand. So we discussed a lot about the positive effect, and the name of this podcast is Longevity by Design. So it sounds like there are a lot of effects that can help you to improve your health span. Less chance to be diabetic, lose a lot of weight, better cognition, better cardiovascular, and so on. So that's amazing. I assume that there is some data about health span and lifespan. And can you discuss that?
So, I can discuss it. Not really, because we don't have sufficient data for that. The only indication we can have is, again, from the studies with bariatric surgery, where we certainly have a very wonderful effect on expected lifetime after the therapy. As I said, it's 9 years for those that have diabetes at baseline. For those that do not have with a normal glucose tolerance, but just obesity, it's 5 years more that you get. And of course, it's less because some of the fantastic results you have on the diabetic complications do not apply to people with normal glucose tolerance. But still, 5 years, that's a lot. So we have the models out there for what is very likely to happen. You can ask the questions whether how easy it will be for people to maintain the therapy for such a long time. And that I cannot answer. It is, so unless you find a good way of extending the therapy after you've reached the weight loss, hopefully with a reduced dose or maybe intermittent dosing, maybe with different compounds, we don't know that yet, it could end up being a problem. Anecdotally, I can tell that there is a GIP antagonist on its way. Very unexpected, a GIP antagonist, which is combined actually with GLP-1 from Amgen. And that resulted after a single injection in a maintained weight loss after a single injection for 150 days. Wow. And after the 3-day phase 1 trial, they had almost a half year's activity with weight loss. So this may be very long acting for reasons we don't understand yet, but it's a monoclonal antibody, so that may be one of the differences. So that could give some hope for a more prolonged activity, which would, of course, be very helpful. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. So now I would like to move to segment 2 and get more nerdy and scientific. So let's start with the first question is, what led you to become a scientist?
I'm a doctor, And
I know.
In principle, we were trained to be interested in science and in the scientific foundation for what we do. And my career I started my career to train to become a surgeon, but I was at a university department in Copenhagen with a lot of scientific traditions. So, I mean, it was the entire milieu was funneled into a scientific mind, and you would expect to do that. So very soon after I started my training as a surgeon, I was involved in research. And very soon this research turned into the field of the gut hormones, and I became absolutely obsessed with that. And my boss became professor at the university, and he was then entitled to have a scientific assistant. And I got that job. And then I produced even more science. And, so eventually after 7 years, I had done a lot of science, but not so much surgery in the end. So then there was a position at the university, and I applied and got it. And then the choice was made, right? more or less without me, but almost automatically.
Great. And can you tell us the story of discovering the GLP-1? How did it happen? What was the story, the backstory?
Yes, so the laboratory that I already mentioned that we created back in 72 was interested in, first of all, in the incretin hormones, because this incretin concept was completely new. What is it that stimulates insulin secretion from the gut? We knew that it was an important factor, but how was this possible? What were the chemical entities that were involved in this? So this was what the laboratory really did. And I had a special problem to look for. That was some of our patients. I came from a department where we were very much working with peptic ulcer, gastric ulcer, duodenal ulcer disease, which was the big disease in those days. And some of our patients, they developed hypoglycemia after the operations. And that was because of too much insulin. So they were clearly overstimulated by something from the gut. So this was a dual interest, find out what is the incretin mechanism and what could explain this hypoglycemia. And so my job was to concentrate on some cells in the gut that they're called the L cells. And they could be demonstrated because they stain with antibodies against glucagon. So they had something to do with glucagon. What it was exactly was not known. So that was how it started. And so I simply started, by extracting intestines, a lot of them, and try to identify that molecule that was responsible for the glucagon thing in the gut. And eventually, it took some years, but eventually we got there and found out what it was. And it was a part of proglucagon. It's called glycyntin. It was not the explanation for the insulin secretion, but it was certainly a part of proglucagon. So we and others started looking for the full proglucagon molecule. And there we had tremendous help from an American molecular biologist who was called Graham Bell, who in 1983 published the cDNA, the DNA stretches that encode for proglucagon in a hamster. That was his tools. And so we got hold of that sequence. And it sure enough demonstrated that our glycyntin hypothesis was correct. It was one half of proglucagon. But then in the other half, there were two stretches, DNA stretches or mRNA as it is, that could encode for something that looked like glucagon, and which was therefore designated glucagon-like peptide 1 and 2, because there were two of them, which was interesting in itself. So we started working on that like crazy, and eventually we synthesized the peptides, and we created radioimmunoassays for these peptides, and then started to looking for the natural peptides. And then we found out that it was very interesting because they were produced in the gut. They were also produced in the pancreas, of course, because you also have proglucagon in the pancreas. But in the pancreas, they were together. They were together in a large molecule, which we call the major proglucagon fragment. And there they were locked up in that structure and inactive. In the same way, in the guts, the glucagon part was locked up in the glycyntin molecule and was inactive. But in the gut, on the other hand, the GLP-1 and the GLP-2, they were cleaved out of the precursor. And we could also demonstrate very early that they were secreted. So we presented that for the first time in 1985 in Madrid. So this was really something, this differential processing of also the new stretch of proglucagon and the fact that they were actually secreted also. And then we started looking at their actions. And I told you that I had this wonderful tool that I love, my isolated perfused pig pancreas that can do everything, a pancreas is supposed to do. Really great fun. And I put these peptides on the pancreas and nothing happened. So that was a tremendous disappointment. So all that story, Christ almighty, Nature papers and everything, it was all rubbish. But then we went for it, for the new peptide ourselves. So we pulled them out. We used our methods. We used all the biochemical techniques, the extraction and all that, and we're able to pull out the nature's own GLP-1 molecule and purified it so that we could sequence it. And then we also put the purified peptide on the pancreas. And this time it worked and gave a tremendous insulin secretion. So now we knew that we were on the right track. And it was different from the predictive structure. That was the whole.
And from what I remember, the half-life of endogenous GLP-1 is very short, like minute or two. So
Yeah.
what have you done, or the team done, in order to increase it? Because it doesn't make sense to inject it and then 2 minutes later.
So this was, of course, very interesting. As after this in a first trial where we infused GLP-1 to people with diabetes and were able to completely normalize their glucose levels, which was really a sensation back there in 1993. Of course, we started injecting people with GLP-1, and we realized that it didn't work. I mean, it didn't work. And the reason why, when we used our rate immunoassays and could find out, it was because it was metabolized so incredibly quickly. It has a half-life in the body of 2 minutes. It disappears. I mean, it's absolutely crazy. So this became a major project in our laboratory. And we found out that the reason was this enzyme, which is called dipeptidyl peptidase 4, DPP4, that cleaved it, and that you could prevent this with inhibitors of DPP4. And we demonstrated that if you inhibited this enzyme, and we used pigs for these experiments, then you could improve the action of GLP-1 on insulin secretion by 3 or 4-fold. So this was picked up very quickly by the Novartis company, and they started to produce new DPP4 inhibitors. The one we had in our hands was a Juul compound that was toxic, could not be used for people, only for our pigs, of course. So that was the start of the DPP4 inhibitors, which became a fantastic story in itself. And they have been, used all over the globe in millions and millions of people with diabetes. And they're very nice anti-diabetic agents. The problem today is there are 2 problems with them. One is that they do not have the beneficial cardiovascular actions, at least to the same extent as a GLP-1 agonist. And the second, they do not cause weight loss. So they cannot maintain the competition with the GLP-1. So
How do you explain that?
That's actually, there's a very good explanation for that. It turns out that there are 2 hormones that are involved in the termination of meals and appetite and all that. One is GLP-1, as I said. The other one is called PYY. So if you treat people with a DPP4 inhibitor, you can protect GLP-1, it turns out. Yes, and now it works better. That's true. But you will also prevent, the PYY has to be cleaved by the enzyme. It has to be cleaved, otherwise it's inactive. So while you improve the actions of GLP-1, you inhibit the actions of PYY, and the net result is no result. So that I think is quite well explained in this way.
Yeah.
So that was a success, but they have come to an end now. We have better solutions for people with diabetes these days.
So how did you, and by the way, I assume that it's happened in parallel in Novo Nordisk and Lilly, and they are just background for our listeners. Those companies work on insulin and long, more stable insulin, all of that for, I don't know, decades. So it makes sense a lot for them to jump into this.
Yeah, I would say, it was not immediately apparent. They didn't jump for it immediately. So it took quite a while. And there was one problem. There's one more problem than the DPP4 that had to be solved. So we studied this. We immediately found out that this was a good way. And then we could stabilize molecules of GLP-1 by exchanging amino acid number 2. We could create resistant analogs of GLP-1. And they would work quite nicely, but they were also eliminated very rapidly with half-lives of 5 minutes instead. And that's because of the kidneys. So there's a renal elimination of GLP-1 and of the natural peptide, and that's very pronounced. So that was the next problem. We found out that and described it and realized that something had to be done about the renal elimination for to be able to make a long-acting compound. And that's where Novo Nordisk quick to work on this. They didn't like the idea at all of working with GLP-1. They said, this is an insulin-producing company. We can sell all the insulin we can produce. Why on earth should we work on this stupid peptide? And this is true. This is what.
And by the way, now they are the highest market cap company in Europe, I think, because of the GLP-1.
Exactly. So that has changed. So, but they were working on precisely as you say, on producing long-acting insulins, and they had found out that by attaching a fatty acid chain to the insulin molecule, they could make it stay in the body for a longer time. That was the insulin detamere that they developed in these days, and which has been used all over the globe instead of the NPH. So they knew exactly how to do this. So eventually they tried this. They put a fatty acid chain to the GLP-1 sequence, and then yes, that was liraglutide, and it worked.
So what was the half-life when they had this?
12 hours. 12
so
hours.
it went up from 1 minute to 5 minutes and then 12 hours. That's amazing.
Yes, that's right.
And the 12 hours is what we have now in the weekly injection, or we have some better than that?
That's much longer. The half-life in the weekly is almost a week.
Oh, wow.
So they're really long-acting.
And what was the modification to the molecule to do that?
So what was done, again, this was taking place at the Novo Nordisk company, where they realized that because, Lilly came up with another solution to the problem of developing a long-acting GLP-1. They combined the GLP-1 molecule with a large protein, and large proteins are not filtered in the kidneys. So in that way, they could escape it. And the dulaglutide, that molecule had a half-life of 1 week almost. So it would work. It would be good enough for weekly injection. So that was the job for the people at Novo Nordisk, to create a new version of liraglutide that would have a half-life of 1 week. And I was on that team myself, so I know very well what happened. It was a wonderful experience. So we were working like crazy, and eventually we came up with, a different fatty acid and a different linker to the molecule and a better stabilization of the GLP-1 molecule also. And eventually we knew that we had a very good compound with a long half-life, and we were very proud when we handed it to development. And that's semaglutide.
Yeah, it's also amazing. Think about the patient. Instead of injecting every day, you need to inject once a week. That's a big relief. As you said, it's not as bad as injecting every day. It's like
that's true.
And I think that's when the value of the GLP-1 was discovered more, because it's also increased the amount of weight loss, correct? From like 8% to 16%.
Yes. So the molecule was optimized for three things: half-life, and that was successful up to 1 week. And insulin secretion, it was also better, more powerful on insulin secretion, and appetite control, and it was also creating greater weight losses than liraglutide. So it was optimized on all three parameters.
And how have you done it? You use a model organism?
Simply by experiments, by exchanging. So the important thing here, so first of all, it was stabilized better against DPP-4, because the liraglutide wasn't really stable. We knew that already. So it was stabilized better, and that was important for the half-life. Secondly, the fatty acid chain, we simply had to make experiments to find the right lengths of the fatty acid, and we ended up with the C18 diacid as the most suitable, because the more you make it bind to albumin, the more difficult it is to excite the receptor. So you really have to find the right balance between the two. And then this chain of fatty acid must be flexible according to the molecule, so that it sits on the molecule, but it should be a loose sitting. There must be a hinge that can move freely. Otherwise, you impair the activity of the molecule. And so they managed to find the optimal. That was the most difficult task of identifying the correct hinge or link, as we call it, linker. Yeah. So there was a lot of medicinal chemistry involved in this.
And the albumin bound is not active, correct? It's only the free is active, or not?
So we think that the main activity is the free fraction. That's right.
Yeah. And the free is very small, 1-2% or something like that?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So it's very similar to sex hormone, like testosterone.
Like other protein-bound hormones, this is the same kind of. You're right.
Okay. Very interesting. Yeah. It's amazing what you and again your team have done in the last 4 decades or so, and what revolution we have right now. So I hope that our listener appreciative of that, and I think that it's a great story. I have tons of more questions, but unfortunately we are running out of time. So I would like to finish with one question about what is your top tip for our listener for health span and longevity? What should they do?
And there's no doubt that you should look at diet and exercise as the most important. I mean, there's absolutely no doubt. And I realize that this is a terrible problem in modern times. It really is a huge problem. You almost don't do anything now these days to get information or to get tools or things. I mean, we just take our smartphones and dial a few figures, and then all of a sudden a taxi drives up in front of the house with the meals. You don't even have to move. I mean, you don't even have to go shopping any longer. Yes. You don't have to move at all. So you have to find a new way of incorporating physical activity in your life. Yeah. And the one way that we in Denmark are very fortunate to be able to do is to use our bicycles to go to work. So a lot of Danes commute on a bicycle, and we're so lucky that we have this very flat country where you can do that. But so for all people, city planners in all the world, they should really think about this very carefully, how people commute, because that is perhaps the most logical way of bringing about health and weight loss, for that matter. Yeah. And then, of course, we really have to think a lot better about the stuff we eat, and make sure to help ourselves and providing food that is not just deposited as fat, but actually helps building up the body instead. And so that, I realize how difficult it is, but it can be done. So we must think about this.
Yeah. And that's very interesting, because you are the creator of GLP-1 basically, and that's the drug that may allow you to be in a way lazy and still lose weight, and still you are telling the audience, eat well and exercise, which is great. I love it.
Yeah, but again, I'd like to emphasize that those that definitely should have the GLP-1 agonists are those with the complications already. And that's a lot. That's millions of people, you know, because it's those with what we call the metabolic syndrome, with the abdominal obesity and a little bit disturbance of the blood lipids and the blood glucose and the blood pressure. And then you have as we call it, the metabolic syndrome. And then all of a sudden your risk of developing cardiovascular disease and dying of it is much increased. Yeah. So everybody who has this, and that's about a quarter of the adult population in the Western world, they deserve a treatment with a GLP-1 agonist if they have not been able to, implement exercise and diet in sufficient amount. Yeah. So I'd certainly recommend. I mean, I realize that there's a huge need for this compound, but I don't take it myself, and I don't think I need it.
Yeah, exactly. And one point about Denmark and Copenhagen, I visited in Copenhagen a few times in the last few years, and every time it's amazed me to see that on every 10 bicycle you see one car. In the US, on every 100 car you see one bicycle.
Yes, that's true.
So I think that we can learn a lot about that, and the commute is something that we need to do. So if you can, instead of taking your car or Uber or a bus and walk or take the bike, suddenly you do something that you have to do because you don't have a choice. You need to go to the barber, you need to buy groceries, you need to, have a meeting.
Precisely.
Yeah, so think about that. And that's, in a way, it's the passive exercise. It doesn't, you don't have to go to the gym.
Exactly.
So that was an amazing discussion. I think that we're coming up to our time. Thank you so much, Dr. Holst.
It's a pleasure.
And we are looking forward to exploring the research in the field of longevity each month with you and the other leader scientists. For more information, please go to www.instatracker.com/podcast. Again, thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Longevity by Design. Please subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, or YouTube. Longevity by Design is powered by Inside Tracker, a personalized health optimization platform that helps people improve their lives by improving their bodies from the inside out, using personalized, science-backed recommendations for nutrition, supplements, and lifestyle changes. To learn more, visit insidetracker.com/podcast.